Okay, so it's an honor for us to have Professor Zecchina here with us today. He is one of the most prominent figures in the fields of statistical physics, computer science, and computational biology. A little bit of bio. He earned his PhD in theoretical physics at the University of Torino. He then went to Trieste and spent several years at ICTP, where actually he has been the head of the Statistical Mechanics Interdisciplinary Application Group. But then in 2007, he moved back to Politecnico di Torino. But then again, in 2018, he moved to University of Bocconi, where he is a professor currently of machine learning and data science. Of course, among the several honors he has been awarded, let me mention the ERC Advanced Grant that he obtained in 2011 or something, with a project on optimization and inference algorithms from the theory of disordered systems. So you may wonder, actually, before letting the floor to Professor Zecchina, you may wonder why me, as an experimental high-energy physicist, I'm introducing a statistical physicist. The reason is that essentially I'm here because of my role in the physics of data, which is, as you know, the master degree project that we launched 2 years ago. So the reason why actually we push forward physics of data is because we recognize the data and that all the techniques that are there in order to infer and squeeze out of the data themselves information are playing a key, more and more a key role in all the domains of science. And we also believe that our community, in a very broad sense, talking about physics community, we do have all the competencies to tackle this task in the most efficient way. And therefore, I think that the colloquium today by Professor Zecchina is actually giving a very notable example of that.
Hopefully. Okay, so thank you very much. Really very honored to be here. So I'm going to give a talk which is about the physics of machine learning, and I'm not going to show you all the spectacular results of machine learning and so on and so forth, because that would be just popularization of science. I really would like to address the issue why physics is relevant for understanding the open problems that are arising in machine learning. Okay, so I will not be too technical, but so my main message is that there is a lot of new physics behind these systems. So this is more or less the the outline of the talk. First of all, I would like to address what is called the mystery of the generalization gap. So how is it possible, essentially, that you can learn from data using huge systems, and we will see what this means. So systems that are characterized by millions of parameters that you have to tune. How is it possible that you learn without overfitting? So it's like, you know, if you have a very high degree polynomial and you want to fit points, it's very easy to go through all points. But as soon as you go out from the domain over which you have fitted the point, the polynomial is going to oscillate widely, and you're not going to be able to make any prediction using that polynomial. So this is just a simple example. So, but one of the big things that have changed in the last decade is the fact that we have understood how to use huge systems to fit data and make prediction without overfitting. And this is highly non-trivial from a mathematical perspective. And so the second question is, why do the algorithms that are used for learning, that have been designed just to minimize convex functions, with one minimum, work so well in the case of systems that are characterized by, in principle, an exponential number of local minima and critical points? And then I will try to discuss which is the physics that is coming out from here, so which are the states that are relevant, and so how we can tackle this kind of problem. And then I don't think I will have time to discuss quantum annealing, but that is just an application. Okay, so for those of you who are not familiar, let me just very quickly specify a few things. First of all, when we talk about machine learning, we mean a huge set of tools. So machine learning is not just one tool. There are many different tools that you can use, unsupervised, supervised learning, reinforcement learning, and then you have all kinds of inference techniques and so on and so forth. Today I'm going to talk about deep learning. Deep learning is essentially learning performed through what are called artificial neural networks. That's the kind of device that we're going to use, and I'm going to define that very specifically in a few minutes. And on general ground, let me say that these kind of systems are somehow inspired from our visual system in the sense that these are made of layers that process information. And they have shown to have impressive results on many tasks. And when I say impressive, I mean superhuman. For instance, if you want to detect the presence of an object inside an image, you can now use these kind of tools, and the error rate of this tool is about 2%, whereas humans typically make an error of about 5%. This is why, for instance, we are talking about self-driving cars. I don't think we will see very soon self-driving cars out there because the part related to taking decision, is still unknown. But the part of recognizing what's going on in a visual scene is actually quite is under control. And another important thing is that it's very versatile. There's a lot of applications. For instance, in physics, it goes from astrophysics to turbulence to the design of new material. I mean, in physics, it's really widespread. So this is essentially the kind of object we are going to discuss. So, okay, what we are implementing is essentially a nonlinear function. Imagine that the input enters on the left, which means that here you can plug in, let's say, an image or a vector containing gene expression level, depending on the domain of application. So on the left, you plug in the data about which you want to make a prediction that you want to analyze. And then on the right-hand side here, you read the output. So for instance, if your issue is to understand whether in a given image there is a picture of a cat, then when you present here the picture, in output, the node corresponding to the label cat should light up. Okay, that's the idea. And this function, this is just a graphical way of representing a highly nonlinear function. Why? Because each node here implements a nonlinear transformation of the sum of all the inputs. And all these edges here carry a weight, a parameter. So you see, this is a highly nonlinear function. So here is the argument, the input, which is then propagated to this level, and then propagated to this level, and so on, so on, and then you read the output over here. So you see, for instance, if you take this node here, it receives the sum of all the inputs, like the local field in physics, right? And where all these edges carry a weight, which can be different. So some of them are big and some of them are very narrow. So which means that the two neurons or two nodes can influence each other in different manners. And then if the sum of all the inputs, so the pre-activation here is above a certain threshold, then this node is going to transmit a signal to the subsequent layer and so on and so forth. So as you can imagine here, so what is interesting here is that the number of edges in real networks can be of the order of 100 million or 300 million. So it's a huge system. It's not a tiny system like this. This was just for purpose of drawing. Now, so here you have a highly nonlinear function, which depends on, let's say, 100 million parameters. And then you want to somehow tune these parameters in such a way that this function implements some desired task. For instance, given some data, you want this function to correctly classify all the examples that you give to the network. Is that clear? So you have some data, a training set, and you want to tune the parameter in such a way that this network on the training set is going to give the correct answer. And so you're going to change all the values of the weight until this is achieved. Is that clear? So this is how it works, how a neural network works. And again, it reminds us of neurons, even though it's highly stylized. It's not, because these links represent somehow synapses, right? So also in synapses, you have the efficacy of the synapse changes. When you learn something, your synapses are going to change. They are plastic. And so in this sense, they're called artificial neural network. But we could easily call this just a nonlinear layer function or whatever. There's not. And what? So again, I will not show you spectacular images. I could, okay? But this is not. I mean, this is a serious university. I want to try to be serious. And so one thing I told you that is that you know, we understood how to use this device in order to avoid overfitting. So to train the system without getting into the into troubles by overfitting the data. But what we have understood in the last years is the following. We, I mean the community, of course, is that when you train this system, the first layers automatically are able to tell you what is relevant in the input. Whereas the last layer of the network somehow, given this decomposition of the input, are able to make a classification. So if you think about it, this is crucial. Think to artificial intelligence, say, 20 years ago or 30 years ago, when essentially it was impossible to do pattern recognition efficiently. How did we try to do that? I mean, how did computer scientists try to do that? They were trying to define a priori certain geometrical features, and then the algorithm would work as follows. First of all, the algorithm had to detect the presence of certain features that were decided a priori by humans, and then, depending on the presence of the features, the algorithm could take a decision. Okay, is that clear? So first you have to decide what is relevant, then check if it is present. Now here, you're not going to do this. You have an end-to-end learning, and the network itself is going to tell you what is relevant in the input. And if you think about it, this is a huge revolution. This has nothing to do with artificial intelligence. It's about extracting information from data, okay? We are as far as we were 50 years ago from artificial intelligence. Nothing to do with, you know, thinking machine or things like that. We are just talking about efficiency in extracting information. But if you think a little bit about it, being able, through learning, to identify what is relevant in the input data, it's a revolution. It's really a revolution. I'm sure you can think about it independently. So this is how a real network looks like. So these are real networks that people use, and each block here is one of those neural networks that I've drawn before with a lot of numbers of links. So these are huge systems, and this is another reason why all the progress happened in the last 10 years, because you need a lot of computational resources to train these systems. Really a lot. You need a lot of data and a lot of computational resources. The footprint of this, machine learning is becoming, the CO2 footprint is becoming non-neglectable. Really, anyhow. So this is how, let me define mathematically just a little bit more how it works. So first of all, there are many architectures, so I'll just take the simplest one. For the sake of this seminar, I'll just take the simplest one. So just a simple multi-layer network. And so you start with some data, and X mu is the input. You could think of it as a picture. And Y mu is a label. So it's telling you whether this picture is, say, in colors or black and white, or things like that. Some feature of some label that you associate to the input. So typically, X is high dimensional. So if you have an image with 10,000 pixels, it will be in 10,000 dimension, the input space. And the label can be 1,000 dimension. Depends on how many things you want to predict. Can be even just 2 values. And as I said before, these nodes implement a nonlinear function, which I call here sigma. And you can think that the overall function implemented by this architecture is nothing but a composite function of this nonlinear transformation. It's a function of a function of a function of a function, layer by layer. So it's a highly, highly nonlinear function. And the argument that each node receives as an input is just the dot product of the output from the previous layer and the vector of weights that connect to the given node. So each node sees a local field, which is the product of the output of the previous layer times the connection weights, okay? So you can imagine that if I ask you, well, please find, try to minimize anything or optimize anything over this device, it's very complicated because it's a highly, highly nonlinear function, okay? And so when we plug in a certain input, what we do typically is to look at the output layer and look at which output is most active and decide that that's the label corresponding to the input. Okay? Something like this. Is it clear, or please, if we can discuss, it's even better. So don't no? Yes. Non so come si accende, no?
I am asking because you
Yeah.
told us to
Sure,
do
sure.
that. But just to clarify, you said that it is very important that in the first part, if I understood, of the process in the first layers, it is recognized what is relevant for the output. But what is relevant to what? To what? It is not clear how. Suppose in your example, you have a picture of 1,000 times 10,000 pixels, and I want to recognize a cat inside this picture. Now, how it can be defined a priori what is relevant and what not against a cat? I mean, if I don't know that I am looking for a cat, of course, because this is not clear to me.
So, the two things. First of all, in the case of supervised learning, when you have labels, you have a computational task. You know that you want to recognize cats or whatever object. So the network, through learning, is going to fix the weights of the first layers. So it's going to identify what is relevant in the input with respect to the final task. Okay? But you have not decided a priori what is relevant. The network is discovering what is relevant in the input given the final task that you want to achieve. First. Second, in the case of unsupervised learning, where I do not know the label, then you can still do things like compress information, and so do some form of unsupervised learning. So you can, for instance, you can take the input, try to reduce the dimension in such a way that from that information you are able to reconstruct the input again. So you are not losing anything, but you are compressing, and therefore you are, somehow you are able to identify the relevant bits in the input in general. Okay? But when I say feature for learning, for classification, these depend on the task that you know. And the task is given by the fact that you have a training set. So you want that on the training set, so on the examples, you want your network to be able to perform correctly. So just to keep in mind an example. For instance, one of the most famous data sets is called MNIST. It's just a set of handwritten digits. You have 70,000 handwritten digits by people, which have been classified. And so you show to the network 50,000 of such handwritten digits, and then you check if the network is capable to recognize your handwritten digit. And it turns out that the rate of error is essentially 0. It has learned to do it perfectly. And that's the simplest one. And again, if you look at the layers, the network learns to decompose the input according to certain geometrical features, like certain type of lines, certain types of elementary features that make then the final classification easier. But at the end of the process, not only you can use it for classification, but you can also ask yourself, how did the network decompose the input so that it can achieve such incredible results? You see, so and that's valuable information. And in fact, you can take the first layers and use it for something else also, if it is a similar task. This is called transfer learning. Okay. Okay. So in general, so this is what we want to do, and then on the training set. So for instance, for handwritten digits, I told you what the training set is. For images, the largest data set is called ImageNet. It contains more than 1 million labeled images. And then what you do is that, on the training set, you define a cost function. A cost function is just a function that, just look at the first one for simplicity. This is a function that counts how many errors your network is making on the examples. You have to imagine that the only thing you have are the data, nothing else, no prior information, nothing. So the only function you can define on the example is how many errors the network makes on the example. So at the beginning, if you start at the beginning and assume that you have random weights here, at the beginning, it will make a lot of errors, right? Random outputs. But your scope is eventually to change the parameter of your system in such a way that the error goes to 0. Once you have learned, then you may hope to use it to make predictions, right? To analyze data that have never been seen. Okay? Is that clear? So this is the loss function that counts the number of errors on the training set cannot be differentiated, so you cannot do any kind of gradient descent algorithm to minimize it. So people came up with a smooth version of it, like a mean square error or the cross entropy, but that doesn't matter for the scope of this seminar. So it's some function that depends on the number of errors that you make, that you want to minimize. Okay, so this is the overfitting problem, and it is a nightmare for a mathematician and not only for a mathematician. Normally, in standard machine learning, imagine this plot is the number of errors you make on the training set versus, say, the size of your system, the number of parameters of your system. Now, the blue curve here is the number of errors on the training set, and the green line is the number of errors you make on some held out data that have not been used for training. So it's what is called the generalization error, the prediction error. And what happens normally is that when you increase the size of your system, it becomes easier to fit the data, just like with a polynomial of high degree. But at a certain point, if you keep on increasing the size of your system, it is going to overfit. And so the generalization error is going to be worsen. Okay, this was the good old lectures from statistical inference in the past. Now, if you actually run experiments with these deep networks, you obtain pictures like this. So here is, let me say, the size of your system. And as you increase the size, the black curve here is the training error. So it's the analog of this blue curve here. And this is the analog of this green line here. So this is generalization error. And as you see, it doesn't overfit. It's just, it plateaus. Okay? And this is important because it's telling you that you can choose a large system which is easier to optimize, that is less constrained, so it has less local minima, less traps that we will see in a minute, and still make very good predictions. And this was totally unexpected, 10 years ago. Okay, if there are some mathematicians here, just don't look at the math, and I just look at this plot. There's been a lot of work trying to characterize the generalization capabilities of these networks, some bounds, rigorous bounds on how well a given system is going to generalize in general. And unfortunately, all the known bounds are so-called vacuous, almost all, which means that in the range of parameters, so let's say that the loss function that you have defined, that you want to minimize in order to perform learning, is between 0 and 1. You just normalize it so that it's in between. And so all the attempts that have been made to bound the generalization error are simply give you predictions that are greater than the largest value that the error itself can take. So they are vacuous. They're not telling you anything. Just to say that it's a big problem from a mathematical perspective to characterize why these devices are generalizing so well, okay? Because all the known techniques provide bounds that are totally vacuous. It's like just saying that you have a spin system and you predict the maximum entropy is greater than log 2. Of course it's greater than log 2 and you're not gaining much, okay? But now let me tell you about an experiment that Google has done recently, something that I don't think you can do here. Certainly I cannot do it in Milan. And it's very computationally intensive. What they did is that they have checked on more than 10,000 different models of neural networks. They've trained more than 10,000 models on 2 very famous data sets. And they've tried to find something, some mathematical quantity that was predictive for good generalization performance. Okay, so let's say they find that whenever this network works well, they find that, say, 50% of the weights are 0. Let's say, I'm saying just a random thing. That would be a predictor for generalization, okay? So they've analyzed numerically in a very heavy, extensive way 40 different candidates, mathematical objects. Yes, please.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but maybe. So when you say 10,000 different models, what is exactly the changes? Not exactly, but different models differs by just the number of layers, or there's something more, there's something deeper than?
No, these are all essentially architectures. Essentially architecture, regularization techniques, and various things, okay? So we are in the realm of deep networks. So essentially convolutional layers plus fully connected layers. And then you can have different architecture, different size, different regularization method, and so on. Okay?
So different sets of hyperparameters.
Different sets of hyperparameters, yes, if you want, yes. That's a lot already, I mean. So, I mean, we cannot even simulate 2 of them. I mean, so that's it's really, and so what they found is that, first of all, many of what was considered from a mathematical point of view, many candidates for good prediction, for good generalization error, were actually anti-correlated with the generalization capability. So they ruled out a lot of candidates, like, say, the norm of the weights or quantities that one could measure on the parameters. And essentially what they found is essentially this result here, that what really correlates with the capability of generalizing of this system is the sharpness of the minima. You remember, we have this loss function that we want to minimize because we want to minimize the number of errors. So you want to find the minimum of a loss function that depends on 100 million parameters through a very nonlinear transformation. And what they found is that essentially, in a few words, is that if you end up in a minimum of this function, which is very flat, then this is going to generalize well. Among the 40 candidates, this was the only robust one. So we have a very high dimensional space of a surface of this loss function that has a lot of type of critical points, saddles, maximum, minimum, and so on and so forth, but the relevant ones are the wide ones, okay? And they conclude that, that somehow the relative success of the sharpness-based measure is something to work on, okay? So this is a 2019 paper, and, and we were very happy to see this because this is actually what the physicists have been doing 5 years before, okay? With a different kind of perspective, different approach, but because the first thing you would, as a physicist, you would do is say, okay, I have this loss function, and this for me is just an energy function because I want to find the minima, right? And how does the surface, how does it look like? What is the physics of which are the most, say, accessible states or whatever? Because at the end, when you do learning, you're going to try to minimize this function through some stochastic gradient process. Yes?
Yeah, so is this equivalent to saying that the importance in generalization is driven by the choice of the metric in the features? Because if you change the metric, you change the shallowness of the minima.
Yeah, yeah. There's okay. You're right. There are some symmetries, like there is a scale invariance. Okay, so you can multiply. There are two symmetries basically in this kind of network. One is the permutation symmetry of the hidden nodes. You can always permute them. And second, in particular for certain type of a nonlinear function, you can multiply by a constant all the weights in one layer and divide by the same constant the weights in the next layer, and that nothing changes. So to give a short answer, you have to get rid of these trivial symmetries. Okay? Once you remove these trivial, what remains is relevant. So for instance, you fix the norm of the weights, so you avoid this scaling, and then you fix the permutation somehow, and then at that point, things no longer have these ambiguities. Okay? So then, of course, there are different ways of measuring the flatness, But at that point, they're all correlated, and so it's kind of robust. It could be, the Hessian, the eigenvalues, or other things. But it's very important that was very technical. Probably you already know about that. So somehow, the physics we are talking about is this. So we have the learning process is a process in which you want to minimize the number of errors, so this energy function that counts the number of errors, in a high-dimensional landscape, analysis projection of a high-dimensional space, I don't know. But you see, in this case, for instance, you have a wide minimum here, and here you have a narrow minimum there. So what's going on? We need to understand this. And I think you immediately get that this is a problem also for physicists, right? Not only for, actually, for mathematicians, it's kind of hard to deal with this kind of object because they're very complicated, so proving things can be very hard. So, I mean, whereas we are less strict in some sense, and so we can move forward, okay? And of course, what we're going to do here is that we're going to analyze this problem as a statistical physics problem. And so we define a Gibbs measure in which we take as an energy function this loss function that we want to minimize. And then by changing the temperature, we can analyze what happens at different energy levels. And of course, we are interested in what happens when we send beta to infinity, so the temperature to 0, because in that case, we're going to analyze the properties of the minima of this function. Okay? And this is what, so what time is it? And this is what, actually, from the point of view of physics, this is what has been already done in the 90s, in the 80s, okay? So in the 80s, I did my thesis on that, I mean, but physicists used to use techniques from disordered systems to analyze neural networks and to analyze but somehow they didn't succeed really. And this is what I'm going to explain, and I'm trying to explain why today. So the idea is the following, is that you have this loss function, and the picture could be like this. And so you have a lot of minima of this function. And so the Gibbs measure at 0 temperature is going to be dominated for entropic reasons by this minima. You have an exponential number of minima, typically. But you might have, somewhere in this configuration space, you might have a wide minimum. And this wide minimum can contain inside a lot of zero energy configuration, but the overall number of this configuration is much smaller than the overall number of the other minima. So what this means is that this state here is a subdominant rare event of the Gibbs measure. So this is hidden in the tail of the Gibbs measure. Is it clear? It's something just rare. So if you sample at random solutions, you will never see these states. Never. Okay? But at the same time, we have just seen from the Google experiments, and actually we derived this before, but that in fact these are the relevant ones for learning. So and this is what I'm going to, so I could finish the seminar here, but anyhow, what I'm going to show is that in fact, the physics of machine learning is related to the physics of rare events. So to the physics of subdominant states, which are subdominant for a detailed balance dynamics, so for a stochastic process that samples according to the Gibbs measure. However, as soon as you have an algorithm which does not satisfy detailed balance, because of many reasons, in which you inject noise which is not thermal noise or whatsoever, these states, because they are wide, have wide basing of attraction, and they become relevant. And so there are two things that cooperate here, accessibility and generalization. They cooperate. They are not one against the other. So these states are both accessible and generalized well. And this was, for me at least, was the surprise. Okay? The only thing is that in the 90s, when we were studying this kind of system, we didn't look at the rare events, so we only saw the green dots, and we couldn't understand what was happening. And there are plenty of papers trying to minimize this energy function here by using well-done Monte Carlo algorithm, and they all fail, because in that case, you just get stuck in the exponential number of local minima that you have. So you shouldn't do things correctly if you want to find the rare events. You should inject noise which is non-thermal, so you should have an asymptotic state of your Markov, of your stochastic process, which is not the Gibbs measure. Is that clear? So that's the message. Okay. Okay, so I think I'm going too slow, so I will skip the part. Sorry, I skip this part just because otherwise I will not reach my. So let's study some cases that we can analyze mathematically in detail. So the simplest model we can analyze is a neural network with one hidden layer. It's not really deep, right? It's very shallow. But this is this is what we are able to do. So we have a network, and on the left you plug in the input patterns, and we have just one output node, for instance. So we want to say, let's say that in input you have the handwritten digits, and in output you want just to say whether the input was odd or even. So you have just two labels, whether it's odd or even, just to simplify things. It's the simplest. But already, for this kind of architecture, you can show that the energy function is highly, highly non-convex, with all these local minima, all these problems. So it's already representative of what's going to happen in deep networks. Okay? And we are, of course, what we are going to study is the case in which the input and the output are just random variables. So we are considering random patterns, not realistic patterns, but random patterns. Why? Because we want to do analytic calculation. And of course, then we are going to check everything on realistic images. And so what is relevant here, so you have a training set which is made of inputs and output label. Previously I was calling the input X and the label Y, now I call it psi and sigma, but it's always the same thing, and these are just random binary vectors. And the control parameter for this problem is the ratio between the number of patterns and the number of variables, so the number of weights. If you have few patterns, it's very easy to fit. So to find the values of the weights such that these few patterns are correctly classified. But if you have a lot of patterns, input patterns, it might become difficult because you have a lot of patterns and relatively few variables, so it might be difficult or even impossible to classify correctly. So what you want to study is this quantity is given a certain training set, which is the volume in the space of the parameters that corresponds to perfect learning. Okay, so how many configurations of the weights do you have such that the training set is correctly classified? Let's say that you have 0 patterns. If you have 0 patterns, everything is fine, so the whole space is fine. So your volume is equal to the volume of the whole space, and of course you have to normalize it properly, but the whole volume. As soon as you add pattern, you cut pieces of the space in a highly non-convex matter, so, and you want to know which is the final volume for a given number of patterns. When this volume shrinks to 0, it means that you've reached the capacity of your network. If you try to learn something more, you will start to make errors. You see, this is a calculation which is independent on the learning algorithm. We are just computing, essentially the probability that this volume exists by tracing over all possible configurations. And okay, I skip the details. We can do this with. Let me just mention that this volume. You see, this is the normalization of the weights. This is the Boltzmann factor, e to the minus beta, the loss function. So you take beta to infinity, so this becomes a 0,1 characteristic function. And so this is just the volume that corresponds to perfect learning. Now, this quantity here is exponential in the number of variables. So it has exponential fluctuation. So if you compute the average of this, it's going to be dominated by irrelevant configurations. So what you have to do is you have to average the log of this, and then the most probable volume will be given by e to the average log of this quantity. It's just a typical problem with exponential fluctuating variables. Anyhow, so we can use the technique from spin glasses and so on. And what you find is the following for this device, that as you increase the number of patterns, at the beginning, you have a connected volume of solutions. So if you have a certain configuration that perfectly classifies all the patterns, you can move around and find other solutions. But at a certain point, the space of solution undergoes a symmetry breaking mechanism, and so the space of solution breaks into an exponential number of components. Okay? And this is it. This was the theory in the 90s. And what do we do with this? It's very interesting because it's curious. but it's totally useless. Because it's useless because, for instance, in this regime here, it's pretty difficult to minimize the function. You get stuck in local minima. So, I mean, if you take literally this scenario, you would not understand why this system works. And the reason is that, in fact, these are the dominant states. And there's something happening behind the back of these states, which is more relevant for learning. You know, because at the end of the day, the algorithm we are going to deal with are not, do not satisfy detailed balance. So there's no reason why we should consider, so that the Gibbs measure is an interesting tool to analyze the geometry, but it's not, should not be interpreted as the asymptotic configuration of an algorithmic process, okay? So in order to understand, well, this is the simplest thing I can do is to consider the simplest neural network that displays this kind of behavior. And this is just a single neuron, a single node, in which the weights are constrained to take just binary values instead of continuous values. And this object here is already very, very complicated in the sense that if you use this so-called binary perceptron, binary neuron, to store patterns, you find that in fact, if you run, for instance, a simulated annealing, you know, your favorite optimization algorithm is going to fail badly on random patterns. So it's a kind of strange result. So you take a single neuron with binary weights, which is pretty realistic, let me say, more than continuous weights in a sense. And it turns out that according to statistical physics, this is impossible to, it's a hard problem to train. Because this is the prediction, I will skip the calculation, but the prediction for this system, concerning the dominant states, is the following, that here you have binary variables, so your space, configuration space is a hypercube, no, of binary variables, and it's just like a golf course. The landscape is a golf course, so it's flat, or you might have even some local minima very high, but so at low energy, you have a flat surface with holes, and the holes are far away one from the other, in Hamming distance, so in macroscopic distance, let me say, Hamming distance in this case. So in a scenario like this, in a golf course like this, there's no hope of actually finding the hole. Absolutely no hope. And in fact, if you would be able to, if you could find one of those solutions, you would get the Turing medal, okay? Because it's very difficult. You have no information to find a hole in a high-dimensional space, you know, with a flat surface. It's a big problem in optimization, finding this kind of narrow solution. And in fact, if you run a simulated annealing on the problem of training this system, you immediately see that simulated annealing gets stuck, and if you increase the size, essentially you don't move from the initial condition. You never go down in energy. So, and this is because it has a lot of local minima, and the ground states are isolated and far away. And in fact, there is a work by Wang and Kabashima a few years ago, in which they computed which is the distance between these holes analytically for random patterns, and they could show that this distance is always of order n in Hamming distance, in number of bit spin flips, which means that they are all far away. As soon as you start to try to learn patterns, then this is the situation. And recently there have been also some rigorous results by two mathematicians about this structure. Okay, so you see, this is the situation. And in this situation, you're not expected to be able to learn. However, what did Alfredo Bernstein already more than 10 years ago is to try some modern algorithm which do not satisfy detailed balance. And we were actually able to very efficiently to find solutions. So there was a kind of paradox. On the one hand, theory predicts no hope. On the other hand, it's very easy, or relatively easy to optimize. So where is the problem? And the problem is that, so what we did, this calculation. We said, okay, let's see if there exist regions in this space of parameters that are dense in solutions. They could be subdominant, but they could exist. So what we defined was a different cost function, which we called the local entropy. And this is nothing but you take a sphere of radius d, And you want to check if there exists a sphere of radius d which contains an exponential number of solutions. Is that clear? So we define the local entropy as the log of the number of zero energy configurations within a sphere, hypersphere of radius d. Okay? Now, let me say that if you believe in this scenario, you have to be crazy to define such function, because the result would be that for sufficiently small distance, it would be trivial, right? It would be just zero, right? However, we had numerical evidence that this was not the case, and so we did this kind of calculation. So you can define this new energy function, which is just proportional to the local entropy, so the entropy of low energy configurations that are particularly dense, very, very dense. And then you can study a new statistical physics problem, which is, again, you can define a kind of a Gibbs measure where now you take e to the minus this y, which is another temperature, which is conjugate to this new energy function, which is the local entropy. So we are searching in this landscape if there exist special regions that are particularly dense. And if you do these calculations, so the idea is the following. Suppose you have, this is a real calculation in one dimension. Suppose that this is your energy function. And now you define the local entropy in one dimension. Depending on the choice of d, your local entropy looks like this. You see, if you, oops, sorry. I don't know what, I did something that I was not supposed to do, but sorry, okay. So, so this would be the local entropy for big distances, for big radiuses. And as you reduce the radius, you see that at the end, your local entropy is going to focus on the widest minimum. Okay? So the idea was, well, okay, if it works, then we can use this to, by annealing the distance, and we could actually find this dense minima. And this indeed was the case. So in the case of binary perceptrons, we did the calculation, and we found that in fact, these regions do exist. They are subdominant, but they exist, and they are very, very dense. When I say very dense, I mean that if you plot the entropy versus the radius of the hypersphere, what you find is that for small distances, this curve overlaps with the log of the binomial coefficient, which means that essentially everything is a solution in this region. So you really have, this golf course, and somewhere you have a flat lake, okay? And this lake is very rare compared to the other holes, but it's there, and that's where the algorithm ends up, okay? Okay, now let me skip this. As a check of sanity, as a sanity check, sorry, one can do the following. One can define a simulated annealing algorithm that instead of using the energy function, uses the local entropy as a cost function. Now, if everything is correct, now this should work indeed, right? And in fact, it does. So if you use, in a simulated annealing, instead of the energy, the local entropy, and you try to maximize this local entropy, then immediately you find, very quickly, you find the solution. So this is how simulated annealing gets stuck, and this is how the other algorithm goes. Okay, so it works. The difficulty is, how do you estimate the local entropy? Because itself is an exponential quantity, so that was the drawback. But, okay, let me see, so I have a few minutes. So let me just say that these results that we found for binary network generalized to networks with continuous weights, which are the ones that are used today. And indeed, we find that also in the case of networks with continuous weight, there exist regions that are particularly dense in solution. And these are not those that we would predict from the Gibbs measure. These are subdominant ones. So an interesting question is, are neural networks special? Is there something special about this neural network device compared to other devices? I think this is a relevant question, because why are we using this, what are called neural networks, and not something else, okay? Well, so we did this calculation. Oops. For some reason, this sometimes goes on. Sorry. Okay. I will skip most of them because I'm going very slow. But anyhow, we can define, on the same architecture, we can define another device which, instead of taking the sum of these weights for the output node, takes the product. Okay, so we call this the parity machine. Essentially, the output is no longer given by a nonlinear function of a sum, or a weighted sum, but is given by some nonlinear function, or even just a linear function, of the product of of the weights of the last layer, of the weights times the output of the nodes of the last layer, okay? So you check the product of the output. So it's a different machine which maps inputs to output, so it's very well defined. This is used in error correcting codes, but let's forget about all this stuff. Now, if you do the calculation on this machine, you find that no dense solution exists. The rare events of this machine are absent, this kind of rare event, and in fact, you cannot use this kind of devices for learning. Okay, so this is an example that shows that it's very important to have a function that depends on a sum of variables, not on a product, because in the case of a sum, you have a lot of degeneracy, so you have a lot of entropy that you can gain, and this helps in creating this kind of structures. Now, so everything at this point was very nice because one could start to understand what was happening, but if you really want to have an interesting theory, it should be predictive somehow. No? You should be able to use this theory to build algorithms if it is worth something. And so this is what we try to do later. And the argument goes like this. So we can define a finite temperature version of the local entropy. So instead of just counting the log of the number of zero energy configurations, we just take the log of the trace of all configurations that have a certain energy which is determined by beta. It's just a finite temperature version of the local entropy. We count how many configurations we have at a given energy, which is fixed by the value of this beta. And this is a Lagrange multiplier fixing a distance. So this, what we call this local free entropy, is just the finite temperature version of the local entropy. Okay? So we have a term here. You see, if beta goes to infinity, this term will be equal to 0 or 1, depending whether L is 0 or not. And this is just a Lagrange multiplier that fixes the distance from the center of the hypersphere. And then we are going to move this center around. Okay, so this is the finite beta version. Now, for this problem, we can define this partition function. Oops. And now you make the following observation. You define, so where it is. Okay, so you have this partition function, okay? Now, where you have two types of temperatures, say, one fixes the level of the internal energy you want to look for, and this Y here is it's conjugate to the entropy. So the larger is this Y, the bigger will be the entropy you find, okay? And of course, it depends also on a distance that is fixed by this gamma parameter. So the key point here is the following, is that if you take Y integer, so you take temperatures that are integers, you can rewrite this partition function as a trace over Y real copies of the original system, which are coupled together by a distance constraint. So, to make a long story short, what we can show is very easy, is that if you take your original problem, you replicate it Y times, where Y should be relatively big, and well, not even too big, but anyhow, and you force these copies to be at a given mutual distance, and on that system you run your detailed balance Monte Carlo process. The asymptotic measure of this process is going to focus on the dense rare minima. So you have a computational way of finding these dense states just by replicating your system a few times and coupling this system together. And in doing this, you change the distance. You start from a large distance, and then you reduce it in order to focus on the minima more and more. Is that more or less clear? So, and in this way, we have a way to estimate an entropy, which, by a straightforward calculation, would be an exponential quantity. So, in short, what you have to do, instead of just having one system, you just take many copies of the original system, you couple them together, and you change the distance constraint, and you simulate this system. And this is going to converge towards dense regions. And from this, you can derive a plethora of different algorithms. And I'm going to spare the description, but you can do Monte Carlo, you can do message passing, leaf propagation, stochastic gradient descent, just by changing the cost function in such a way that it's going to concentrate on the rare events of the original one. And it's kind of interesting to observe that a lot of the tricks that are used in deep learning are of this sort. So you don't find a single algorithm in deep learning which is minimizing the loss function really. They always introduce some extra noise, some regularization tricks, whatever, in such a way that your stochastic gradient process is not going to converge to Gibbs measure. It doesn't satisfy detail balance. Now, this has happened in 20 years of work through different labs, and they tried, they tweaked. So at the end, it has been an evolutionary process. But what's happening nowadays is that you use algorithms which have particular initial condition, particular noise, and so on and so forth, and in such a way that the process is driven towards this kind of dense region. Of course, I cannot prove rigorously this statement for the algorithm because it's very complicated. This is a kind of intuition which is motivated by the statistical physics calculations. But for sure, they do not satisfy detail balance. And then by analyzing the flatness of the solution, you can actually check whether this is true or not. And Google paper is relevant because it's actually checking exactly this. They've checked that algorithms, those that work, end up in these flat regions. Okay, so I think I have exhausted. In fact, I had many more things to say, but let me just fly over one thing that, of course, there are many things you can do. One thing is, for instance, you can ask yourself, can I change something in the architecture of my network such that I increase this phenomenon? I create even bigger dense regions. Well, yeah, the answer is yes. If you choose particular activation function, particular nonlinearities, you can increase the contribution from these dense regions. And so what we found, and let me skip this because it's really, I don't have time, but what we found is that the kind of functions that are used today, so today, at the beginning, neural networks use functions which were like this. So you have a node, and the kind of function here which was used was, say, a function more or less like this, a sigmoidal function. But now, they use functions which are like this. Okay? These are called ReLU functions. So again, through some experimentation and trial and error, they find out that these are much better functions to use. And so we computed which is the density of solution in this rare minima that you find when you use this function compared to this function. And in fact, you find that these favor the creation of very dense regions. And we did even something more than this. And what people did is they found some other function which was a slight variation of this, something like this, and they found that they work even better from doing experiments. So we did the following calculation with Enrico Malatesta. Okay, let's now try to find the functions which maximize the local entropy in the case of random pattern and see if they work. And so we find a very funny result. I just show it to you because you see here, what we found is actually a bunch of harmonic oscillators. So we found that if you take a quadratic function or any even power, it works better. And we tried, and it does. And this was just an exercise that we did a few weeks ago. We never published this, but I mean, we really don't really understand what is optimal. But if you do this calculation, and we check that if you use as an activation function, instead of these nonlinearities, you use just a parabola, it works better. Okay? And this was also in generalization. It was obtained just maximizing the local entropy. Okay. Now I hope I've...
Sorry, but that was for random patterns, right? The last thing you said.
Yes. Okay, all the calculations are done for random patterns. We are modifying the ensemble, but we always check on realistic data through simulations. So that's...
And they still work better.
Sorry?
And they still work better.
They still work better. Of course, there's a dynamical problem. So you have to tune the initial conditions because we don't know how to characterize all the local minima. So, but here we are just optimizing the ground state. I'm not suggesting that you should use harmonic oscillators to build a deep network. I'm just saying that if you do that calculation, you find that it works, and it works. And it's ridiculous, but it works. I mean, Now, there is a reason for this. Okay, this is just, it's not very serious. It was not the topic of the, anyhow. The reason is that these models are symmetric, plus or minus. I mean, all these nodes, the output can be, depending on the transfer function, can be positive or negative, and the weights can be positive or negative. So if you have an even function here, you can use this symmetry to increase entropy. That's why they pop up. If you want to do a biological model in which everything has to be positive, then you will lose this symmetry. Probably you will find something else. This is something we are going to discuss with a neuroscientist, a friend of ours, how to actually make things. But I mean, there are a lot of results that hopefully can transfer to neuroscience that are based on this kind of optimization principles. And I don't have time to talk about them, but they are kind of interesting. So just to summarize, what we have observed in the last decade is that this system have undergone an evolution. So the loss function have changed. So at the beginning, people were using mean square error. Now they're using cross entropy. The transfer function have changed. At the beginning, they were using a step function. Now they're using this ReLU function and so on. The learning dynamic has changed. They've added noise. They added regularization techniques and so on and so forth. The number of layers, and so what we have observed is that most of these features contribute to actually change the landscape in the sense they give more statistical weight for stochastic process to the wide minima compared to the narrow minima. So all this experimentation that was done in the labs, from a physical perspective, was changing the landscape from a very rough landscape to another kind of landscape, which is kind of dominated by this wide minima. So this is the reason why it's so difficult to understand what's happening, because nowadays, if you take your favorite model on the market and you run simulations, this is already pre-cooked. There's a lot of tricks, and so you only see the final result of this evolution. So you don't really understand what's behind. You see, you just see, let's say, one minimum, because everything has already been smoothed out, and so you miss the theory behind that. Okay, because just you see a portion of the truth. So this is why you have to go through this, say, approach of starting with simple models and then understanding which are the potentialities and how to amplify these dense minima. Okay, so the conclusion is so the out of equilibrium physics, so the rare events are crucial and they are attractive for a lot of processes which do not satisfy detail balanced. Okay, which are the learning process. And this there's evidence from works in computer science and also work that we are doing that this is the case for deep networks, for which, of course, we cannot do the calculations. And also, the only non-trivial mathematical bound is obtained by using this kind of technique on the generalization error. I mentioned the vacuous bound. The only non-vacuous bound, even though it's not very good, is obtained by this kind of, so also from a mathematical point of view. Now, there are a lot of open problems on which I think young people should focus. One is to try to generalize this kind of results to unsupervised learning, which is by far the most relevant issue in machine learning. So most of the data have not been labeled by human, right? So you have just the data and you want to extract information from it. And another very interesting topic is to use this system to detect causation patterns. And here there's a line of work which is very interesting, which you take data taken from different scenarios that contain some common, say, law. If you are able to extract invariances across data, you can extract the law, okay? And this is a way of automatizing the extraction of causal relation, which is just started, but it seems very fascinating. There's a lot of work for math, and also, and I don't have time to discuss this, but trying to obtain some mathematical results about the generalization capability of this system, which are known to work in practice, is an open problem, and which is, again, very fascinating for mathematicians. Another aspect which I find important is probably data should be modeled in a better way, because on the one hand, we consider random data, uncorrelated random data. Quite often, mathematicians consider any sort of data. So they want to obtain results which are valid for any type of data. The truth is between the two, so probably we want to look at compositional data, so to define ensemble on which we can obtain results and try to match this with the behavior of machine learning tools, but we have not yet been able to do this. There's some line of work also on this by some colleagues of mine, but it's... and then we believe that this idea of looking at dense regions which are accessible by greedy stochastic process which do not satisfy detailed balance is actually relevant in many other applications. So we are starting to apply this to other fields, and hopefully we have some results. So I don't know, I've given you an overview without any flash. I didn't show you any spectacular movie on how this network can be used to reconstruct the face of a person that doesn't exist, or to do super resolution, or to drive a car, or all this kind of stuff. This is the math and the physics behind this kind of tools, and I think it's pretty clear that we are very far from understanding everything about it, but there's a lot of physics. And in particular, there's a lot of auto-equilibrium physics going on here. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. I think it was extremely interesting. Yeah, there are several questions, so we'll start from here.
Okay, maybe it's related to these open problems, but I was thinking about the typical physics case in which essentially we can have a tiny systematic discrepancies between the training sample and the learning sample. So I mean, we are training our network or either on simulated data or on real data, which have some tiny but unknown systematic. So do you have any guess on how robust are these stochastic? Are all these techniques that you described on this kind of discrepancies?
Yes, this minima, and another way of defining this minima is by their stability. So they are robust to perturbation of the inputs. So it's another, so yes, the answer is yes, these kind of minima that are, it's kind of obvious, right? If you have a solution which is surrounded by an exponential number of other solutions, even if you perturb something, you will still make the same prediction. So they are robust to perturbation in the input, if that is, you know, so in the case of augmented data like the one you are saying, I mean, these are kind of robust to that, yeah.
Yeah, you connected at some point the superiority of the swish versus linear activation function to your proof that with these parabolic activations you can get this to work on random inputs. And I failed to understand whether this is an indication that in cases where the swish works better than the ReLU, you have some symmetry latent in the configuration space that this might be the cause of the superiority of the output and the
okay, I didn't want to enter in this because again, it was just kind of was done for fun essentially. But anyhow, the idea is the following: you take your neural network, the one that we can analyze, and you find for a given level of for a given number of patterns that this network has to learn, you want to find the transfer function that has the largest wide minima, the largest local entropy. And you can show that the sigmoid has a small local entropy compared to the ReLU, which is smaller to the one compared to the swish, which is smaller than the one compared to the parabola. And then you can check on Cipher 10 or this kind of data set, and you show that in fact you gain something in generalization. That's what we did. But we didn't write up anything. It's just, you know, because the idea was, can I use something which only depends on the training set, like the entropy, to create something that generalizes better? That was the scope. And then we have to think about it. But this comes out from you really optimize the function, you find a curve like this. Oh, what is that? You fit it, and it's a parabola.
One question. Can you go back to the previous slide? Yes. I would guess that for the local entropy, there's some kind of trade-off if I have a local minimum, which is very spread, versus a global minimum, which is quite peaky.
Yeah.
So when you change now the loss function, can you somehow, does this influence all the minimum in the same way? So can you change this trade-off by changing the cost function, the activation function, sorry?
Well, sorry, I probably missed the trade. Are you saying that you might have, so are you describing a situation like this? I mean, in this high-dimensional space in which you might have a wide minimum and then a narrow minimum like this?
Yes.
Yeah, so again, which one would you use to make predictions?
I would prefer the peaky one.
This one?
Yes.
No, it's not. This is not correct, in my opinion, because it's a Bayesian argument.
Okay.
So somehow, all this, so what is the best thing you can do? The best thing you can do is take all models, all values of W, take a majority vote among all configuration of the W's, weighted by their likelihood, right? So, which is related to the depth of this. So it's true that this has a smaller likelihood, but you have a lot of configuration contributors. So from a Bayesian perspective, it could be very well the case that it's better to favor wide minima compared to one which fits the data perfectly, but is very sensitive to any little perturbation. So
okay, that's then the complete idea of the overfitting of my peak, giving me an overfitting in the test data then in the end.
So this one could overfit in the test, yes.
Okay.
And this is less likely to overfit.
And then when I calculate the entropy, I get the bigger one, the local minimum, as well as my targeted minima.
Yeah, you can choose which is the level of energy you're looking at. So if you have, but let me tell you one thing. In deep learning, normally you choose so big networks that you're always in this situation, always, almost always. So your system is always so big that you always fit the data set, almost always. You have 300 million variables to tune, and so the training error always goes becomes very, very low. So it's just a matter of choosing the widest minimum. But the point is that in fact algorithm would never find a narrow minimum. What may happen is that they find some other wide minimum which is local somewhere else. And so this is why you want to use this local entropy technique to favor convergence between to those low-lying minima.
Okay, thanks.
You show that Google, with brute force, with some tricks, with some methods, analyze several configuration of networks and find some property that tells you where is the local minima and what are the best
predictors for generalization.
Okay. So by telling the story, it might be that the story may become a way to let's say, construct a new neural network configuration. Yeah. Are there some plan to, let's say, exploit the new possible configuration by the brute force, or try everything and evaluate them?
Yeah, there's a field of research which is called NAS, Network Architecture Search, in which essentially you search in the space of architectures, which is very huge, and it's very, very complicated, highly non-convex. And my next PhD project for the next student I can torture will be to apply this local entropy approach in the space of architecture. So I want to find those architectures that are most robust to perturbation of the architecture, and at the same time generalize well, and see which are the ones that come up. I think this would be very interesting to relate this also to evolution. I mean, find connection with neuroscience, but I mean, I'm too ignorant for that.
Before giving the mic to Samir, just a quick one. So in terms of generalization properties, the degeneracy doesn't really matter. So whatever you choose in terms of the value of the W is the same. That would generalize the same way.
You mean
Yeah, there, right? I mean,
here?
yes.
So let's say, you mean
There,
any
yeah.
of these?
Yes.
No, no, no. You want to choose the one which is at the body center, because
You do want to do that, otherwise.
yes, because that is the one which is the most stable one.
Okay.
Because if you're on the boundary, you will be unstable. I mean, it's a complicated discussion, but there's a Bayesian interpretation of this.
Hi, thanks. I want to ask you if you can comment a little bit on the data side, in the sense that, as far as I understood, this machine learning revolution was also allowed not because, of course, of the evolution of the algorithm used, but also because maybe in the last 10 years, I mean, we had the big data revolution, and so basically, even all the architectures with all that didn't work, but with much more data, they started to work very well. So can you comment a little bit about on the data side? So
yes. Well, I think it's interesting to fix a date. So when did everything start? Okay, and so the year is 2012, just to fix an idea. Why? Because there is a data set which is called ImageNet. I think it's spelled like this, ImageNet. And every year, computer scientists working in computer vision have a competition, and they want to design an algorithm which is able to detect the presence of an object in an image among 1,000 different possible objects. So you have, this data set is 15 million images. But anyhow, you have a set of images, and all these images can, in principle, contain up to 20,000 different objects inside. But the challenge is limited to 1,000. So it could be a bottle, a computer, a chair, a glass, a microphone, whatever. 1,000 objects. And what happened is that during the years, so this is, let's say, this is what 2010, 2011, and the error, so here's the error rate made by human, which is 5%, okay? And then in 2011, the best computer algorithm was doing 26% of error. Now, in 2012, what happened is that Hinton, with some students, they trained one of these networks on this huge data set, and that's why it's important to have the data set, for 6 months. And they were able to reduce the error to 16%. Now, it's really a lot, because in the previous year, the points were like this, okay? So this was a huge jump, and the community just woke up at that point. Because, I mean, how is it possible? And since then, the error has gone down, and now the error of the machine is about 2%, and as I said, the error of human is about 5%. So you see that here, so having this data set available was really important. And this is a set of images which is obtained from the internet. So clearly, 20 years ago, it was not there, it was not possible. So there are several ingredients. I totally agree. Data, very rich. Computer power, GPUs and so on, which are cheap. And then new algorithm, also new ideas. Because still, we don't really understand everything about these systems. So, but yeah, the data revolution is really important.
This landscape that you draw in configuration space is just a cartoon, is in 1D.
Yeah.
But
no, it's not a cartoon. That was an actual calculation.
Sorry?
It was a real calculation. No, it was not a cartoon.
Yes, but how you cannot represent it in a 1D? The space of configuration.
I thought you mean the plot of the one-dimensional energy. Okay, we're talking
No,
about
I'm saying that the valley with a lot of local minima, it might have a very complicated structure.
Yes.
So I don't know if you can define maybe it's a branch structure which is very ramified.
Oh yeah, yeah. This is a super interesting question. This is a hypersphere, but it could be that the solutions are just branching out in some different, very strange way. So how is really the real actual geometry of these regions is not under control. What we can only say is that given a region of a certain radius, we can count how many ground states you find inside, but how is the geometry? This is actually very difficult to analyze. And if you look at the Hessian, you can say something, but it's a totally open problem, and actually it's very interesting, very, very interesting problem. Yeah, very interesting.
Another question. And what is the meaning of the other minima that come out? It is just
Which other minima?
the other minima that you have in the landscape after you have learned. I think, there is this one that has the valley with a lot of minima. The other is just something that is not saying anything, or does they contain some other information?
Okay, I think that this has to do with, it's a mathematical aspect. It has to do with the high-dimensional nature of these problems. So most of the things happen on the surface, right? So these are configurations that classify correctly the pattern, but are on the boundary of your allowed region of values. And therefore, if you flip it a little bit, they're going to make errors. So they are point-like. So there is a natural tendency in high dimension to create this kind of solution. So let me say, if I can say so, it's a pathology of being high dimension. So that's so I don't think they have particular interpretation to it. They're just configuration that barely satisfy all the pattern constraints and can easily make a mistake if you perturb them. And this is a natural thing happening in high dimension. So it's an entropic aspect of high dimension. But what you're interested in are actually the other ones, which do not have this pathology. Yeah.
Other questions? So actually, if not, I have one myself, which is more kind of a...
You don't have to.
No, really, because I think it's more kind of an epistemological question. So I want to hear your opinion about that. I think that the reason why several people in the physics community are a bit uneasy with this whole approach is the fact that somehow... So take the example that you said at the beginning, right? The fact that now networks are actually preparing the data much better than what we could do typically, right? Essentially the feature preparation, like identifying the actual features, the actual variables that are relevant for the classification problems is a task that is performed best by the network rather than by humans, right? And we, as physicists, that's our job, right?
Yeah.
So that's what, I mean, if we have a physical system that we want to describe, then we use physics in order to understand what are the relevant observable variables that are needed in order to describe it from the physical point of view. And being told that, okay, we are superseded by a machine, I can...
you said so, I didn't say that.
No, but we actually see that, right? I mean, we have colleagues looking at, let's say,
of course,
astronomical data. We at the LHC looking at the detector data. We are actually using these things all over the place. So actually, myself, I actually believe that we can use these tools in order to extract information, also physics information, so that is not just superseding our role. So actually, I think this is just an opportunity for us, not just, let's say, being superseded.
Yeah, I think it's an opportunity to do science in a different way, which is more powerful, but that's it. I don't see any danger in this. I mean, as I said, there's no, at the moment, there's no automatic way to extract causation patterns. So if you want to understand what's really happening, you still have to understand the physics of the problem or the model underlying the problem and whatever.
The question was whether you believe that these kind of things can help us in extracting those things, extracting the causality.
Yes, of course, so I think they help. But what I'm just saying, they help because somehow they can simplify. For instance, in the case, again, in the case of images, you can look at which kind of features are important. Then you can think about how to model this in a compositional manner. But most of the applications by now are kind of brute force. I mean, so it's a step forward compared to what we were doing 30 years ago, in which we had to define a priori what was relevant in the input. Now, the machine can perform end-to-end learning and therefore can work even without this information, which is very important and useful for physics. But this doesn't mean that you are able to extract the physical law that is going then to apply to many different domains in many different contexts. So all these techniques are very specific to the data set you are given. So from that to extract something which is valid in general is still an open problem. I would say it's a really amazing problem. But so everything is valid within a given domain. So in the case of images, we have plenty of data and we are done for that kind of task. But that doesn't mean that you have solved, you have understood how our visual system works. No, No, absolutely not. So these are statistical machines, statistical inference machines, which work through optimization, through all these kind of things that I try to describe. The progress has been made mainly through optimization, right? Optimizing this kind of system, not really a statistical inference. It is a statistical inference progress, but it was driven by optimization. And so I see just as a kind of a coprocessor that is helping us to do our job, so not as a danger.
Okay. So if there are no other questions,
thank you very much.
Now let's thank again Riccardo Zecchina.